What silly tautology results from the attempt to represent the capitalistic limits of the labor fund, as its natural and social limits may be seen, in Professor Fawcett. The circulating capital of a country, he says, is its wage fund. Hence, if we desire to calculate the average money wages received by each laborer, we have simply to divide the amount of this capital by the number of the laboring population. That is to say, we first add together the individual wages actually paid, and then we affirm that the sum thus obtained forms the total value of the labor fund determined and vouchsafed to us by God and nature. Lastly, we divide the sum thus obtained by the number of laborers to find out again how much may come to each on the average. An uncommonly knowing dodge this. It did not prevent Mr. Fawcett saying in the same breath, the aggregate wealth which is annually saved in England is divided into two portions. One portion is employed as capital to maintain our industry, and the other portion is exported to foreign countries. Only a portion, and perhaps not a large portion of the wealth which is annually saved in this country, is invested in our own industry. The greater part of the yearly accruing surplus product, embezzled, because abstracted without return of an equivalent from the English laborer, is thus used as capital, not in England but in foreign countries. But with the additional capital thus exported, a part of the labor fund, invented by God and Bentham, is also exported. In this chapter, we consider the influence of the growth of capital on the lot of the laboring class. The most important factor in this inquiry is the composition of capital and the changes it undergoes in the course of the process of accumulation. The composition of capital is to be understood in a twofold sense. On the side of value, it is determined by the proportion in which it is divided into constant capital or value of the means of production, and variable capital or value of labor power, the sum total of wages. On the side of material, as it functions in the process of production, all capital is divided into means of production and living labor power. This latter composition is determined by the relation between the mass of the means of production employed, on the one hand, and the mass of labor necessary for their employment on the other. I call the former the value composition, the latter the technical composition of capital. Between the two, there is a strict correlation. To express this, I call the value composition of capital, insofar as it is determined by its technical composition and mirrors the changes of the latter, the organic composition of capital. Wherever I refer to the composition of capital, without further qualification, its organic composition is always understood. The many individual capitals invested in a particular branch of production have, one with another, more or less different composition. The average of their individual compositions gives us the composition of the total capital in this branch of production. Lastly, the average of these averages in all branches of production gives us the composition of the total social capital of a country, and with this alone are we, in the last resort, concerned in the following investigation. Growth of capital involves growth of its variable constituent, or of the part invested in labor power. A part of the surplus value turned into additional capital must always be retransformed into variable capital, or additional labor fund. If we suppose that, all other circumstances remaining the same, the composition of capital also remains constant, then the demand for labor and the subsistence fund of the laborers clearly increase in the same proportion as the capital, and the more rapidly the capital increases. Since the capital produces yearly a surplus value, of which one part is yearly added to the original capital, since this increment itself grows yearly along with the augmentation of the capital already functioning, since lastly, under special stimulus to enrichment, such as the opening of new markets, or of new spheres for the outlay of capital in consequence of newly developed social wants, and the scale of accumulation may be suddenly extended. Merely by a change in the division of the surplus value or surplus product into capital and revenue, the requirements of accumulating capital may exceed the increase of labor power or of the number of laborers. The demand for laborers may exceed the supply, and therefore, wages may rise. This must indeed ultimately be the case if the conditions supposed above continue. For since in each year more laborers are employed than in its predecessor, sooner or later a point must be reached, at which the requirements of accumulation begin to surpass the customary supply of labor, and therefore a rise of wages takes place. A lamentation on this score was heard in England during the whole of the 15th and the first half of the 18th century. The more or less favorable circumstances in which the working class supports and multiplies itself in no way alter the fundamental character of capitalist production. as simple reproduction constantly reproduces the capital relation itself. The relation of capitalists on the one hand and wage workers on the other, so reproduction on a progressive scale. Accumulation reproduces the capital relation on a progressive scale. More capitalists or larger capitalists at this pole, more wage workers at that. The reproduction of a mass of labor power, which must incessantly reincorporate itself with capital for that capital's self-expansion, which cannot get free from capital, and whose enslavement to capital is only concealed by the variety of individual capitalists to whom it sells itself. This reproduction of labor power forms, in fact, an essential of the reproduction of capital itself. Accumulation of capital is, therefore, increase of the proletariat. Classical economy grasped this fact so thoroughly that Adam Smith, Ricardo, and, as mentioned earlier, inaccurately identified accumulation with the consumption, by the productive laborers, of all the capitalized part of the surplus product, or with its transformation into additional wage labor. As early as John Bellers says, for if one had 100,000 acres of land and as many pounds in money, and as many cattle without a laborer, what would the rich man be but a laborer? And as the laborers make men rich, so the more laborers there will be, the more rich men, the labor of the poor being the minds of the rich. So also Bernard de Manville at the beginning of the 18th century. It would be easier, where property is well secured, to live without money than without poor, for who would do the work? As they ought to be kept from starving, so they should receive nothing worth saving. If here and there one of the lowest class by uncommon industry, and pinching his belly, lifts himself above the condition he was brought up in, nobody ought to hinder him. Nay, it is undeniably the wisest course for every person in the society, and for every private family to be frugal, but it is the interest of all rich nations, that the greatest part of the poor should almost never be idle, and yet continually spend what they get. Those that get their living by their daily labor have nothing to stir them up to be serviceable but their wants which it is prudence to relieve, but folly to cure. The only thing then that can render the laboring man industrious is a moderate quantity of money, for as too little will, according as his temper is, either dispirit or make him desperate, so too much will make him insolent and lazy. From what has been said, it is manifest that, in a free nation where slaves are not allowed of, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor, for besides, that they are the never-failing nursery of fleets and armies, without them there could be no enjoyment, and no product of any country could be valuable. To make the society happy and people easier under the meanest circumstances, it is requisite that great numbers of them should be ignorant as well as poor. Knowledge both enlarges and multiplies our desires, and the fewer things a man wishes for, the more easily his necessities may be supplied. What Manville, an honest, clear-headed man, had not yet seen, is that the mechanism of the process of accumulation itself increases, along with the capital, the mass of laboring poor, the wage laborers, who turn their labor power into an increasing power of self-expansion of the growing capital, and even by doing so must eternize their dependent relation on their own product, as personified in the capitalists. In reference to this relation of dependence, Sir F. M. Eden in his The State of the Poor, and History of the Laboring Classes in England, says, "The natural produce of our soil is certainly not fully adequate to our subsistence. We can neither be clothed, lodged, nor fed but in consequence of some previous labor. A portion at least of the society must be indefatigably employed. There are others who, though they neither toil nor spin, can yet command the produce of industry, but who owe their exemption from labor solely to civilization and order. They are peculiarly the creatures of civil institutions, which have recognized that individuals may acquire property by various other means besides the exertion of labor. Persons of independent fortune owe their superior advantages by no means to any superior abilities of their own, but almost entirely to the industry of others. It is not the possession of land or of money, but the command of labor which distinguishes the opulent from the laboring part of the community. This would give the people of property sufficient influence and authority over those who work for them, and it would place such laborers, not in an abject or servile condition, but in such a state of easy and liberal dependence as all who know human nature and its history will allow to be necessary for their own comfort." Sir F. M. Eden, it may be remarked in passing, is the only disciple of Adam Smith during the 18th century that produced any work of importance. Either the price of labor keeps on rising, because its rise does not interfere with the progress of accumulation. In this there is nothing wonderful, for, says Adam Smith, after these are diminished, stock may not only continue to increase, but to increase much faster than before. A great stock, though with small profits, generally increases faster than a small stock with great profits. In this case, it is evident that a diminution in the unpaid labor in no way interferes with the extension of the domain of capital. Or, on the other hand, accumulation slackens in consequence of the rise in the price of labor, because the stimulus of gain is blunted. The rate of accumulation lessens, but with its lessening, the primary cause of that lessening vanishes, the disproportion between capital and exploitable labor power. The mechanism of the process of capitalist production removes the very obstacles that it temporarily creates. The price of labor falls again to a level corresponding with the needs of the self-expansion of capital, whether the level be below, the same as, or above the one which was normal before the rise of wages took place. We see thus, in the first case, it is not the diminished rate either of the absolute or of the proportional increase in labor power or laboring population, which causes capital to be in excess, but conversely the excess of capital that makes exploitable labor power insufficient. In the second case, it is not the increased rate either of the absolute or of the proportional increase in labor power or laboring population that makes capital insufficient, but conversely the relative diminution of capital that causes the exploitable labor power, or rather its price, to be in excess. It is these absolute movements of the accumulation of capital which are reflected as relative movements of the mass of exploitable labor power, and therefore seem produced by the latter's own independent movement. To put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable, the rate of wages the dependent, not the independent variable. Thus, when the industrial cycle is in the phase of crisis, a general fall in the price of commodities is expressed as a rise in the value of money, and in the phase of prosperity, a general rise in the price of commodities as a fall in the value of money. The so-called currency school concludes from this that, with high prices too much, with low prices too little money is in circulation. Their ignorance and complete misunderstanding of facts are worthily paralleled by the economists, who interpret the above phenomena of accumulation by saying that there are now too few, now too many wage laborers. The law of capitalist production, that is at the bottom of the pretended natural law of population, reduces itself simply to this. The correlation between accumulation of capital and rate of wages is nothing else than the correlation between the unpaid labor transformed into capital and the additional paid labor necessary for the setting in motion of this additional capital. It is therefore in no way a relation between two magnitudes, independent one of the other. On the one hand, the magnitude of the capital, on the other, the number of the laboring population. It is rather, at bottom, only the relation between the unpaid and the paid labor of the same laboring population. If the quantity of unpaid labor supplied by the working class and accumulated by the capitalist class increases so rapidly that its conversion into capital requires an extraordinary addition of paid labor, then wages rise, and all other circumstances remaining equal, the unpaid labor diminishes in proportion. But as soon as this diminution touches the point at which the surplus labor that nourishes capital is no longer supplied in normal quantity, a reaction sets in. A smaller part of revenue is capitalized, accumulation lags, and the movement of rise in wages receives a check. The rise of wages, therefore, is confined within limits that not only leave intact the foundations of the capitalistic system, but also secure its reproduction on a progressive scale. The law of capitalistic accumulation, metamorphosed by economists into pretended law of nature, in reality merely states that the very nature of accumulation excludes every diminution in the degree of exploitation of labor, and every rise in the price of labor, which could seriously imperil the continual reproduction, on an ever-enlarging scale, of the capitalistic relation. It cannot be otherwise in a mode of production in which the laborer exists to satisfy the needs of self-expansion of existing values, instead of, on the contrary, material wealth existing to satisfy the needs of development on the part of the laborer. As in religion, man is governed by the products of his own brain, so in capitalistic production, he is governed by the products of his own hand.